If I know most of you as well as I think I do, you simply cannot get enough spooky content in your lives. And that's why today's episode is sponsored by the very best streaming service for original horror movies from around the world, Shudder. Shudder has the most extensive collection of movies and TV series, from Hollywood favorites and cult classics to brand new features that you simply won't find anywhere else. Shudder is commercial-free, completely uncut, and best of all, there's an exclusive new horror movie premiering every single week. Previous premieres have included the mom vs. creepy cult chiller, The Twin, starring a Discovery of Witches actress Teresa Palmer, not to mention the obscenely twisted, gore-splattered outbreak horror, The Sadness. On top of that, there are brand new episodes of Eli Roth's acclaimed series, A History of Horror, as well as the riveting Cursed Films and The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs. This month, I was thoroughly disturbed by the Taiwanese horror movie The Sadness, which is honestly one of the most blood-curdling, horrifying pictures I've ever seen. Those who are familiar with Garth Ennis's epic comic series Crossed will be all too familiar with the premise. And for those of you that have long lamented the impossibility of a TV or movie adaptation, I can assure you, this is it. Those that aren't familiar with Crossed and are tired of the played-out zombie outbreak trope, I can promise you, this one is very, very different. The virus in The Sadness, just like the one in Crossed, doesn't turn its victims into zombies. Instead, it turns them into vicious, depraved, and perverted murderers who do and say the most shockingly obscene things imaginable. There are things you'll see in this movie that will quite literally turn your stomach, and although I can't help but recommend it to the most ardent horror enthusiasts, please be warned, it is not for the faint of heart. And you too can be thoroughly disturbed by The Sadness for just $5.99 a month or $56.99 annually, a subscription fee that will allow you access to some of the most riveting and frightening horror content around. And since Shudder truly appreciates us horror junkies, it's given me a unique promo code that gives you guys a 30-day subscription completely free of charge. Just go to shudder.com, enter the promo code LetsRead, and check out The Sadness for yourselves. But please, and I don't say this lightly, exercise extreme caution when subjecting yourselves to the levels of violence and obscenity that The Sadness includes. It takes a lot to make me grimace these days, and I lost count of the number of times I was compelled to either shield my eyes or let out an involuntary "oh my god" at some of the on-screen degeneracy. So again, please heed my warning. And now, without further ado, on with today's stories. I was never really into video games when I was a kid. Given how into them my brother was, I always figured they were more for boys than they were for girls. He used to play all these super violent army kinds of games, stuff that didn't interest me in the least bit. But then I remember him playing this one game that looked a lot different from all the others. The art style and the clothes and the really nice music in the background, it had me transfixed from the second I laid eyes on it. Then, when I asked what he was playing, he replied with 3 little words that have become some of the most precious memories of my whole life so far. Final Fantasy VIII. It was the only game I ever found myself watching him play, and after he graduated to a PlayStation 2, I got his old PS1 and finally got to play FF8 for myself. I was just hooked for quite a long time, and without a doubt, my favorite character was Selphie. Selphie is this super cute and derpy member of your team who uses this awesome nunchaku things to fight with. She also has the coolest hair of anyone in the game, in my opinion anyway, and she just so happened to kinda look like me too. So then one day, me and my friend were doing each other's hair with these new curling irons her mom bought her, and I decided to curl the ends of my hair up like Selphie. I think that was the first real attempt at a cosplay I ever did. And so when I learned there were actual groups of people who not only dressed up like video game characters, but met at conventions to show off their outfits and costumes, I was so about it. So over the years that followed, I ended up amassing all the items of clothing that Selphie has in her outfit, all with the goal of attending the biggest video games expo in the country, E3. It wasn't easy, finding the right style of boots, finding a dress in the perfect shade of canary yellow. But eventually I managed to piece together an outfit that looked exactly like Selfie's. The only thing I was lacking was the nunchakus, but then, like a lot of cosplayers, I ended up getting hold of a cheap plastic toy pair that I painted in the same style as Selfie's. Then finally, when everything was ready to go, I waited for E3 to come around, and my dad drove me and my brother there as a very special shared birthday present, as our birthdays are just a month apart. The E3 we went to was one of the first ever to be open to the public too, so it really felt like something special to be able to attend. People were so nice about my outfit, and other FF8 cosplayers were coming up to me and asking for photos. And although my brother thought it was a total drag having to be my personal photographer for a while, he was an awesome brother and took lots of pictures of me with people so I could remember the whole thing. But he had only so much patience for that kind of thing, so in the end, we agreed to split up and meet up later on so he could check out all the exhibits he wanted to go see. I was on my own, but I was around so many other nice people that I didn't think I was in any danger at all. Besides, the whole place was teeming with security guards and stuff, so it felt like the safest place I could possibly be, around all kinds of like-minded people who, like I said, were being so nice to me. The first sign of trouble came when this one guy came up to me, told me Selfie was his favorite Final Fantasy character, then asked for a picture with me. For like the 100th time, I stopped a passerby, gave them my digital camera, then asked if they'd take a picture of me and the person I was with. Then as they were lining up the shot, the guy started saying, all low in my ear, "You know, you look really, really cute in that outfit." Then just as the person took the picture and was handing me back my camera, he grabbed my butt under my skirt so hard I actually yelped out in pain. I turned around, instinctively throwing a slap in the guy's direction, but he backed off so quick that it just missed while people jumped in between us like, hey, what's going on here? I was shouting stuff like that he just grabbed me, that this idiot just grabbed me, this pervert. Only with way more curse words and all that kind of stuff. One of the guys that jumped in pushed the guy away, then came over to me to see if I was okay, and I ended up kind of venting to him a little about how I'd had such an amazing time, all until this butt grabber came along to spoil it. He told me that there were way too many guys like that at cons, but even so, there were few and far between. Then he did the nicest thing ever and offered to walk me around the convention hall as a kind of bodyguard to make sure that it didn't happen again. I mean, the guy was tall, handsome, and he seemed like he was just that, some kind of knight in shining armor. So of course I said yes to the idea, and then we went walking around the con together. So the way the guy was dressed, he had like a samurai kind of sword with him. Like I want to say that he looked like the vampire killer Blade from those movies, but I know he wasn't that character because when I asked him, he just laughed and told me that he was supposed to be a guy from some anime thing. Obviously, the sword he had with him wasn't real, but we talked about how cool it would be if I had an actual pair of nunchakus, how no one would mess with me or try grabbing my butt if I could show off what a ninja master that I was with them. That's when he turned to me and said that, as much as he wasn't allowed to bring any real weapons along with him into the convention hall, he had brought along the things that he usually kept in his trunk for personal protection, and that just so happened to be a pair of nunchakus. I thought that that was just about the coolest thing I'd ever heard, and I was so impressed when he told me about all the martial arts that he did, hence why he owned a pair of real-life nunchakus. So when he finally asked me if I wanted to go out to his car and check them out, I didn't hesitate at all. He'd been the perfect gentleman so far. Why would I expect anything to change? We carried on chatting about this, and then as we walked out to his car, with me asking him if his nunchakus were heavy, how long he'd been training with them, and all of his answers seemed super genuine and honest. Then we got to his car after walking through the parking lot for a while, and I swear that I was more excited to see a real-life pair of nunchakus than I had been about the whole E3 thing in the first place. But then when he opened up his trunk, I didn't see any. I turned to look at him all confused, expecting him to have a similarly confused look on his face like, I'm sure that I left them here. But instead, the look he had was one that literally made my stomach drop. His face was expressionless, except for this intense look in his eyes. When I saw it, I knew that I had made a huge mistake. The next thing I know, he's trying to shove me into the trunk of his car, and I just let out this manic screech of pure terror. I screamed longer and louder than I ever had in my life, before or since, not even words, just like a wail of absolute horror as I realized all the brotherly protectiveness he'd been showing me was just an act. The same guy that had warned me about weirdos at the con, about how there were only a few of them and nothing to worry about, he was one of them, and he had been intending on kidnapping me from the very get-go. He actually managed to get me all the way into his trunk at one point, and if it wasn't for me sticking a leg out at the last second, he'd have gotten me trapped in there for good. It was both a kind of blessing and a curse, though, because the force with which he brought the trunk down onto my leg made it feel like he'd broken it. It was numb, and I guess that was just the adrenaline staving off the pain. But in that moment, I screamed like he really had broken my leg or something. That bought me a little bit more time to try and fight my way out of the trunk. But then the more that I fought, the more that I realized that it was no good. He was bigger and stronger than me, and it was only a matter of time before he managed to completely overpower me. And by far the worst part was when he told me, "Don't make me shut you up." He'd been saying shut up and be quiet almost the whole time, but when he finally said, "Don't make me shut you up," I realized that it was either go along with the abduction, or he might actually choke me out or strangle me completely in order to not get caught in the act. But then what choice did I have other than to carry on trying to save my own life? If I hadn't, I literally wouldn't be around to tell you this story. Also, I guess by this point you're wondering how I got out of such a horrible situation. And honestly, it was nothing I did myself. It all came down to a stroke of pure luck. It just so happened that some latecomer had been driving through the parking lot looking for a parking space, and just so happened to be driving through the same section we were in when they heard my screams. It kind of makes my mind boggle at how the universe had to align that perfectly so that someone heard my screams, as aside from the latecomer, the parking lot was basically deserted of any people. If we'd gone out to his car a little earlier or later, or if that guy and his kids hadn't been stuck in traffic that morning after driving in from out of state, there's a good chance I wouldn't have survived that weekend. After running towards the sound of my screams, the guy managed to scare the guy trying to kidnap me, who just took off when he realized that he'd been discovered. The rest is kind of a blur of crying, talking to cops, and then driving to the hospital to get my leg checked out. With the only really good news being that the cops managed to trace the guy's rental car to his dad because it was rented in his name, and that's how they managed to arrest him before charging him with attempted kidnapping. It was my first real cosplaying experience, and it was completely ruined by some complete psycho who took advantage of my vulnerability to gain my trust enough to attempt to kidnap me, and possibly even kill me. Who knows what he truly had in mind after that? It took me a long time to be able to even attempt to cosplay again, as the whole thing made me feel overwhelming anxiety whenever I so much as looked at my selfie costume. This year, I'm finally able to actually wear it again, but I honestly don't think that I'll be able to wear it in public or at any kind of convention anytime soon. It's not just what happened to me either. It's that I heard a lot of different stories about how female cosplays just make a certain kind of guy act a certain kind of way. It's like they see the fictional character and just assume that we're not real people ourselves. That's the way I've come to see it anyway. And it's not just with their actions either. I see all kinds of horrific comments directed towards female cosplayers on a variety of different websites too, be it Reddit or Twitter or even Facebook sometimes. It makes me think cosplay is something I should just enjoy on my own, or with a circle of like-minded folks online, in communities that can be easily policed and controlled. But again, that's just the way that I see it. Either way, I'm going to be very, very careful with my cosplaying in the future. And honestly, as scary as my ordeal was, not being able to express myself like that just makes me really, really sad. I used to go to Pittsburgh Comic-Con almost every year, and I knew one of the promoters personally. Mike used to give us free tickets if we handed out flyers for him, as he was always super busy running his store Comics World in Winber. If anyone listening is from Pittsburgh, you might remember the place, as it was basically a mecca for Pittsburgh nerds of all fandoms and allegiances. Mike was such a cool guy, too. He was always so chill and friendly to anyone who walked into his store. I think he used to volunteer as a referee in Pee-wee basketball games, too. At least that's what I heard. He just had this reputation as being a really nice, community-oriented guy. I used to stop by Comics World at least once a week to browse his new stock, but then this one week, I stopped by to find the store closed. It wasn't like him to close the store up during operating hours, so I called the store's number to see if everything was okay. But then there was no answer there either, so I actually started to worry a little. I returned the next day about the same time, and the store was closed again. So as much as I didn't want to, I headed over to the only other half-decent comic store in town to see if they had anything I was interested in. When I arrived, I happened to see a guy I knew from hanging out at Comics World, probably there too because he too had found the store to be closed and needed somewhere else to browse. I went over and said hey to him and then asked if he knew why Comics World was closed on a Saturday of all days. He just looks at me all shocked and says, "You haven't heard?" Then launches into an explanation as to why Comics World probably wouldn't be opening up again anytime soon. Mike had been arrested, which was shocking enough, but then the guy told me why he'd been arrested, and I swear I spent the minutes that followed with my jaw on the floor of the store. Before I tell you what he'd been arrested for, there's something you need to know about Mike. We didn't know too much about his life, but we knew that he used to live in Michigan before moving out to Pennsylvania. He ran a comic book store, which was also called Comics World, with his ex-wife, but after she tragically passed away, he ended up just packing up his life and moving to a different state, probably to escape all the painful memories. No one I knew ever talked to him about it, not at length anyway. I think it was something he just mentioned in passing to someone at one point, and it must have made its way down the grapevine to us. I mean, you hear about a guy losing his wife like that, you don't exactly make it the main topic of conversation the next time you see them, do you? Especially when it was painful enough for him to have to move cities to try and get a fresh start. But then that's what got me so shocked when this guy told me why Mike had been arrested. It had been all over some news website that I just hadn't seen. Mike had been taken into custody for the murder of his own wife 17 years earlier. From what I read in the months after his arrest, Mike had basically faked a robbery at the comic book store after killing her. I think mainly to throw the cops off his scent, but also to maybe claim on insurance too. I'm not sure how he managed to evade suspicion for the better part of 2 decades, but I guess his covering up of the crime actually worked, at least for a while anyway. I know he was living with a girl here in Pittsburgh, so maybe that had something to do with it too. Like he knew his wife would help herself to her share of the business or something if he decided to run off with this other woman. A lot of the Pittsburgh comics crowds just flat out didn't believe it at first. One guy I knew told me that he'd already stood trial a few years later, but that he'd been acquitted. The cops just kept wanting to pin the murder on him for some reason, and I guess in the end, it was because he actually did it. Because at his second trial after he was arrested, he got life in prison for his wife's murder. It's just terrifying to think that he wasn't anything like the man that I thought he was. He masqueraded as some pillar of the community when, in reality, he was anything but. I just don't get why he didn't just divorce his wife and take the financial hit instead of outright killing her. Surely that would have been easier of an option in the long run. Makes me think he was just evil from the start, that he had something in him that made him think that he was smarter than everyone else, and that he had more of a right to a few bucks than his wife did to her own life. If he could do that to her, what would he have done to someone like me if a few bucks were on the line? Makes you wonder if you ever really know someone at all. I've been going to San Diego Comic-Con for most of my adult life. But the first time I ever went way back in 2010, something seriously crazy happened before one of the panels. I'm a huge Resident Evil fan. I love everything about the universe and the lore, and although the movies haven't always been of the highest quality, I was excited to catch the Afterlife panel in Hall H. This is about the same time I found out that the next panel was going to include Seth Rogen and was for some new Simon Pegg comedy called Paul. I'm pretty indifferent to Simon Pegg, but I was a big Seth Rogen fan back then, so I figured that I'd stick around and check it out. Hall H was absolutely jam-packed at the time, with every single seat taken, so like many others, I found myself standing at the back of the hall without a seat. Me and a friend of mine were just standing around, discussing where the Resident Evil franchise was headed, and then out of nowhere, we just hear the scream from not far off. All heads turned to the direction of where the scream came from, and all I saw was this guy with blood streaming down his face. He has his hand over his eye, and right next to him, a bunch of people are mobbing this one kid who looked like he just stabbed the other kid in the face with something. The whole back of the hall erupted into chaos for a few minutes, with a few people basically sitting on the kid who'd lashed out while others ran out to get security and the cops. Eventually, the cops showed up and put the kid in cuffs, and as he was being let out, I noticed the weirdest little detail about him. He was wearing a blue Harry Potter t-shirt. I don't know why that stuck with me so much. I guess because it was the last thing I expected him to be wearing. That whole franchise is so innocent and positive, at least I think so anyway. So have a kid that was a fan of that stuff to be so violent was super disturbing to me. Then when I learned that it was all apparently down to the one kid sitting too close to the other, that it was all just some dumb disagreement over seat space, that was ultra disturbing to me too. I mean, what a thing to almost blind someone for life over. Just some random space in a convention hall. And all for some half-baked sci-fi movie that some British dude made. Pure insanity. That's pretty much the one messed up thing I've ever seen at Comic-Con, as it tends to be a really chill and positive experience. But honestly, I always wonder if the next year I attend is going to be the time that I see another nerd rage incident like that. California comic book conventions are arguably some of the greatest in the entire country. Given their proximity to the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, it's not unusual for the LA or San Diego Comic-Cons to host some of the most well-known writers, actors, or artists of the comic book world. And a less renowned but more consistent attendee was graphic novelist Blake Leibel. Leibel was originally born in Canada to wealthy parents consisting of a realtor father and an heiress mother. He is perhaps best known for his 2010 work, Syndrome, which is the story of a sadistic doctor who happens to be obsessed with serial killers. Leibel describes Syndrome as a story about obsession on a number of levels, as experienced by four characters who all come from different worlds and yet find themselves embroiled in this giant, impeccably simulated environment. But Blake is famous for another reason too, one even darker than his macabre creative output. During the spring of 2016, a 35-year-old Blake was living in a West Hollywood apartment with his 30-year-old girlfriend, Ayana Kassian. Ayana was a Ukrainian-born tax office prosecutor and part-time model with whom Blake had fathered an infant daughter, and although their relationship had once been something of a fairy tale romance, the preceding few months had seen it deteriorate rapidly. On the night of May 25th, Blake and Ayana's daughter were staying with the latter's mother, who was visiting from Ukraine and staying in a nearby apartment. It's not clear if this is because she simply wanted to spend some time with her granddaughter, or if the cracks in Blake and Ayana's relationship were widening at an exponential rate, but it could easily have been a mix of both. Because that night, whether in cold blood or a fit of rage, Blake came up with a devilishly permanent solution to their very temporary problem. The following morning, Ayana's mother called over to Blake's apartment to check on the couple, but no one would answer the door. She then called Ayana and Blake's phones, but neither picked up. She began to walk away from the apartment building with a sense of growing concern. Then, as she turned around to look at the window of Blake's apartment, she saw something lurking at the edge of a closed curtain. Someone who had been peeking at her as she walked away. Ayana's mother became racked by a feeling of deep dread, and suspecting that something was horribly wrong, she immediately called the Los Angeles Police Department to report that something awful might have happened to her daughter. When they finally arrived at the apartment building, they discovered that Blake had barricaded the door of his home and was refusing to come out. It didn't take long for them to break into his apartment on the suspicion that he had somehow harmed his girlfriend, and when they did so, they made a gruesome discovery. Lying on the couple's bed was the lifeless corpse of Ayana, who had been scalped before being completely drained of blood and horrifically mutilated. To illustrate some of the terrifyingly perverse things that Blake Leibel did to her, I'll refer you to the autopsy transcripts of Los Angeles County Coroner Dr. James Ribes' deposition. Cassian's entire scalp was traumatically absent and was not present near the body. Her skull had been stripped down to the surface of the bone, and there was no scalp present except for little bits in the back of the neck. Portions of the right side of her face were torn away, including the right ear, all the way down to the jawline. There were quite a number of bruises and abrasions on the face, primarily on the left cheek jaw area, including one which turned out to be a human bite mark. She had lived for approximately 8 hours after receiving the scalp injury, something I have never seen before. I doubt if any forensic pathologist in this country or abroad had even seen this outside of wartime. The many morbid details of Dr. Ribes' report are as shocking as they are disgusting, but it's the final one which is undoubtedly the most disturbing. Ayana Cassian was essentially tortured to death, and although it's not clear if Blake incapacitated her before inflicting the majority of her injuries, the fact that she remained alive for 8 hours after he tore her scalp off is nothing short of nightmare-inducing. 2 years later, in June of 2018, Blake Leibel was convicted of first-degree murder. In light of the fact that he had subjected Ayana to a grisly and prolonged bout of torture, and the fact that he attempted to plead not guilty to charges of murder, torture, and aggravated mayhem, he was given a life sentence in prison without the possibility of parole. It's an unreasonable assumption that artists who deal with dark subject matter are all varying degrees of deranged. Most are able to deal with macabre subjects and maintain a healthy state of mind. But the actions of Blake Leibel seem to be evidence to the contrary, that in one particular case, all the darkness an artist has stored up in their mind wasn't neutralized or compartmentalized in any way. It was simply trapped up there, festering away, waiting to be unleashed on whoever angered him sufficiently. And what's really disturbing is that the person he forced to endure hell on earth was the mother of his child, arguably the love of his life. We can only imagine the horrors he'd have inflicted on someone he wasn't so close to. Someone like you, or someone like me. Elizabeth Barraza and her husband were both die-hard sci-fi and Harry Potter fans, and to celebrate their upcoming 5th wedding anniversary, they planned a fun-filled vacation to the new Harry Potter world in Orlando, Florida. Liz was also a huge Star Wars enthusiast, and when she wasn't working at her job as a data reporter, she could often be found creating elaborate cosplays for herself and her husband Sergio. One of the couple's shared hobbies was cosplaying at theme parks, as well at various comic book sci-fi conventions. But cosplaying wasn't something they did purely for recreation, as they also used these same costumes in their roles as volunteers with the 501st Legion, a group of volunteers who dress up in costumes from Star Wars and visit sick children in Houston area hospitals. The couple were a very charitable pair, but they definitely weren't the wealthiest, so to offset some of the expenses of their Florida trip, they decided to have a garage sale at their Tomball, Texas home on the morning of January 25th, 2019. But that same morning, as Elizabeth was setting up the tables she planned on using in the garage sale, a dark-colored Nissan Frontier truck pulled up in front of the Barraza home. The person that got out of the car had long hair, and wore what appeared to be some kind of robe, with CCTV cameras capturing them walking towards Elizabeth before engaging her in a brief conversation. Seconds later, the person in the robe pulls out some kind of handgun and fires 4 shots in Elizabeth's direction, leaving her splayed out in her driveway as her attacker bolts back towards their truck. Then, in a disturbingly eerie turn of events, the shooter appears to circle back around the back in their truck, slowing down at the Barrazas' driveway to ensure that Elizabeth was dead. After that, they sped off, probably after hearing the sirens from the emergency vehicles which were fast approaching, having been called in by an anxious neighbor. Elizabeth was rushed to a nearby hospital, but tragically, she was declared dead the following morning, all at the very same hospital where she had volunteered so many times before. Just 29 years old at the time of her murder, Elizabeth's organ donor status enabled her to save the lives of 4 separate individuals in the wake of her untimely death. But this was nothing but a cold comfort for her devastated husband and family members. Naturally, they demanded justice for their slain loved one, but despite all the efforts of the Tomball Sheriff's Department, her killer has not yet been brought to justice. Her family even offered a reward of $50,000 in the hopes that someone could shed some light onto who her killer might be, but to this day, no one has ever come forward with any useful information. The murder of Elizabeth Barraza remains an unsolved mystery, but thanks to the surveillance footage released by the Harris County Sheriff's Office, there are a few things that we can deduce regarding the killer's identity. Firstly, the vehicle they were driving was recorded by multiple cameras in the Barrazas' neighborhood, and after idling near the driveway for a while, a person can deduce that they got out of the driver's side door, indicating that they were probably acting alone. It's also clear that this vehicle was seen driving through the neighborhood on the night before the murder, as well as before Elizabeth was shot, which makes it clear that the killer was somehow scouting out the scene of the crime before moving in for the kill. Given that the killer sprinted away from the crime scene, they must have been in fairly decent shape. But beyond that, the clothes that they were wearing make it very difficult to get a good look at them. Some have even suggested that the long hair was merely a wig intended to disguise their identity. According to the security footage, the shooter doesn't seem to suffer much recoil after firing each round, and on top of that, there were no shell casings found at the scene. This indicates that the killer probably used a smaller caliber revolver, and the fact that they were firing with just one hand on the grip shows that they were comfortable and experienced in using firearms. After shooting Elizabeth 3 times in the torso, the killer then steps forward and fires a single final shot into her head. Then as they begin to flee, they bring a hand up to their head. This is another indicator that the person was wearing some kind of wig, and that they didn't want it to fall off in the process of escaping the scene. This little detail leads into the robe that the individual was wearing, which may have also been some kind of costume to distract from their actual identity. It should also be noted that the killer just so happened to park in the ultimate blind spot for cameras throughout the neighborhood, another indicator that they'd carefully planned the attack so as not to be easily identified. Then, in August of 2019, almost half a year after Elizabeth's murder, investigators announced that they had a possible break in the case. As the months went by, although investigators would not divulge which aspect of the investigation this break pertained to, Harris County homicide detective Michael Ritchie told one Texan media outlet, "I feel that the results of that warrant will be critical in the investigation and most likely will expose the suspect and who's responsible for this." Following this statement, rumors began circulating that Elizabeth's murderer was actually some kind of contract killer. This was down to one of the more unnerving details, how the shooter had circled back around to the crime scene after originally fleeing. They may have needed to drive back around to take a picture of Elizabeth's body lying in the driveway. Elizabeth's father, Bob Nuella, would comment on this particular detail in 2020, saying that them circling back and driving back by the house literally a few moments later is proof there's something bigger at work here. Detective Michael Ritchie also confirmed these suspicions when he told reporters, "I feel they contacted somebody and said, 'Hey, the job's done.' And then that person said, 'Are you sure?' And they turned around and drove by the scene one more time." Something that investigators have always struggled with in regards to Elizabeth's murder is the motivation behind this well-planned and well-executed slaying. While it's abundantly clear that it was a premeditated attack, the frustration in identifying the killer has led some to theorize that it was actually a completely random killing. Elizabeth has not advertised the garage sale ahead of time, nor had she posted about it online. And while she had posted signs up for the garage sale that morning, she had only done so minutes before Sergio left for work. This means that, despite many claims to the contrary, it's essentially impossible that her killer used knowledge of the garage sale to target her, and that it was simply a lucky break in their monstrous scheme. However, what's curious is that numerous sources have confirmed that Elizabeth would have naturally departed for work by that point in the morning, as she made a habit of leaving early to avoid the Houston traffic. This only gives credence to the idea that her killer was aware of her plans that morning and knew where she would be, but some of the only people to know that she wouldn't be heading into work were her coworkers, as Elizabeth had called out of work that morning. Yet her killer also still knew to wait for her husband to leave before launching the attack, which indeed suggests they had intimate knowledge of the couple's morning routine. Then there's the fact that the killer spoke to Elizabeth for a few seconds. Was this simply to confirm her identity, or did Elizabeth actually know who killed her that morning? Until they're identified, this is an aspect of the case we can only speculate on. It's entirely possible that Elizabeth's killer might have been someone that Sergio was having an affair with, but there's been very little evidence of this, and all those that knew the couple have dismissed this as nothing short of preposterous. Investigators spent hours and hours combing through the digital lives of both Elizabeth and Sergio in the hopes of finding a potential motive, but nothing remotely incriminating has ever been found, and neither of them have been threatened prior to the shooting, so there seems to be no apparent reason for this crime tied into their relationship. After eliminating that particular possibility, we come to a very disturbing prospect, that the murder pertains to Elizabeth's involvement in the cosplay community. It shouldn't be lost on us that the killer was wearing a kind of costume when they showed up that morning. I mean, they probably had the wig and robe on hand when they decided to take Elizabeth's life. Is it possible Elizabeth had rubbed someone the wrong way while at a cosplay convention? Someone who wanted to wear some of the same items they'd worn on the day of the offense so that Elizabeth would recognize the person she'd angered. It's clear that Elizabeth's murderer wanted her to know who they were, or they wouldn't have taken the time to talk to her before firing the fatal shots. Perhaps Elizabeth had a rival in the cosplay community, one who was sick and tired of her showing them up at events or conventions. Granted, that makes for a fairly outlandish theory, but after eliminating the possibility of a love rival, there's very little left for us to speculate on, other than her involvement in the local cosplay community. But regardless of motive, the way in which the shooting played out makes the motive seem incredibly personal. If it was some kind of hit, was it a member of the local or national cosplay community that took the contract on her? Elizabeth was definitely one of the more talented costume creators in the country, and perhaps she was treading on toes of someone who could gain financially from her death. It seems that as long as the motive for Elizabeth's murder remains a mystery, so will the identity of her killer. And maybe, when her killer is finally caught, it'll give us a terrifying insight into the fiercely competitive nature of the American cosplay community, and show how certain individuals in a group that prides itself on being loving and supportive might not be so peaceful and well-meaning after all. The 2017 Phoenix Comic-Con started out much like any other. On the morning of Thursday, May 25th, the Phoenix Convention Center opened its doors to a veritable legion of costume-clad comic book enthusiasts, most of whom were intent on nothing more than some wholesome, fantastical fun. But there was one among them who had much more sinister intentions for one of the convention's special guests. And if it weren't for the swift actions of another, that weekend's Comic-Con might have been marred by a horrific act of very real violence. One of the Thursday's attendees was a man in his 30s named Matthew Enrique Navarro Sterling. Many of those that surrounded Matthew as he walked into the convention were sporting a variety of homemade prop weapons, and while some might have looked very real, for the most part, they were completely harmless. However, the items that Matthew carried in a large black bag were very real and very dangerous. In his bag were two .45 caliber handguns, a .454 caliber handgun, a 12-gauge shotgun, a combat knife, pepper spray, and throwing stars. But while Matthew was carrying enough weapons to kill dozens of fellow attendees, he had only one target in mind that day: Jason David Frank, perhaps better known as the original Green Ranger. Jason intended to be at the con all 4 days for photo ops, autograph signings, and a Friday panel, whereas Matthew intended to make it his last. He might have been nothing but an overweight comic book enthusiast, but Matthew had managed to delude himself into thinking he was actually the Punisher, a Marvel Comics character focused on vigilante justice. After entering the convention hall, Matthew made his way up to the second floor before taking out his phone and sending a series of viciously violent Facebook messages to several friends and public figures. One of these public figures was an LA-based singer, composer, and cosplayer named Reiko Takahashi. She and Matthew had met before, back in 2014, and over the next year, they exchanged friendly messages about his fitness goals. Then, one night after a concert, Reiko got off stage to find her phone full of messages from Matthew. His tone had changed, and he was threatening to harm another cosplayer. Reiko stopped communicating with him, gave the woman a heads up, and contacted a friend who was a police officer. The threats had resulted in Matthew getting a warning over the threats, and he had refrained from further contacting Reiko, all until May of 2017 when he announced he was about to do something big at a comic book convention near his hometown. Once again, Reiko contacted the police and soon found herself warning a Sergeant Scott Nichols of California Hawthorne's police department about Matthew's threats. With Reiko's help, Sergeant Nichols deduced that Matthew was most likely attending the Phoenix Comic-Con, and he rushed to contact the Phoenix Police Department to inform them of the potential danger. Just 11 minutes after Sergeant Nichols called in the threat, officers of the Phoenix Police Department were combing through the throngs of convention attendees, and when they found Matthew gearing up for his attack on the second floor, they subdued and arrested him without any injury to the public. Matthew pleaded not guilty at his preliminary hearing for attempted murder, and due to his dangerous, unhinged state of mind, his bail was set at $1 million. He exhibited a dramatic threat to the community beyond police officers, beyond Jason David Frank, explained Maricopa County Deputy Attorney Ed Leiter. Leiter then added that a number of other people were referenced as possible targets or people he wanted to kill. Naturally, such a close call made international headlines, and in the aftermath, Jason David Frank encouraged Comic-Cons everywhere to increase their security procedures. Surprisingly, Jason was graciously empathetic with his prospective killer, saying in an interview that, "I don't know this individual, but I will pray for him." Jason was then informed that Matthew had claimed to have stabbed the actor during a previous encounter, something he rather humorously denied. "I think if you mention stabbed and I haven't been stabbed, the story speaks for itself," he said. In response to the incident, convention security was beefed up for the remainder of the event. Entrance points were limited, bags and belongings were thoroughly searched, and those with replica or prop weapons would be forced to leave them at home or risk being refused entry. This included what were referred to as weapons from fictional sources, such as plasma rifles, phaser, and even lightsabers. Even those cosplaying as Ghostbusters were bizarrely affected, with one ad hoc safety regulation stating that proton packs are allowed. However, the neutrino wand will need to be disconnected or permanently attached to the pack. From what I can tell, the reactions of attendees, vendors, and special guests were surprisingly mixed. Some welcomed the increased security measures, arguing that they were essential to ensure that all those who attended conventions could be kept safe. Yet others felt that the new draconian regulations were an unnecessary damper on the creativity and panache of those who cosplayed. A handful of cosplayers saw the funny side and replaced their arsenals with witty cardboard signs or sword-shaped balloons. Others didn't see the funny side, and one artisan lightsaber vendor complained that they'd lost thousands of dollars in yearly revenue. A Facebook user used the analogy of a stinging insect to explain the futility of the move, saying that it does absolutely nothing to prevent other bees from stinging you, just like this fake weapons ban won't do anything at all to keep another lunatic from waltzing in like the Punisher. Another user spoke of the financial hit that the guerrilla prop craft industry would have to endure, saying it would punish hundreds who have worked hours on their cosplays because of one lunatic. Others were far more safety conscious, commenting that they didn't understand how very few commenters on this seemed to realize how severe this whole thing is, and giving up a stupid cosplay prop for safety measures is not the end of the world. Another saw the silver lining of the increased security measures, admitting that, yes, it was inconvenient, but the show could just as easily have been canceled. Instead, they came up with this solution. I'm appreciative that no one was hurt and that the con went on for the rest of the weekend. Count your blessings, folks. Whether attendees agreed with the increased security or not, it seems almost a miracle that no one was hurt that day. Matthew Sterling constituted a heavily armed psychopath in their midst, and he could have just as easily decided to target random convention-goers rather than focus his psychopathic rage on an ex-Power Ranger. We can only be bizarrely grateful that he chose to cryptically warn a member of the cosplay community, whose quick thinking allowed swift action by local law enforcement, who subsequently brought Matthew into custody. If he hadn't, if Matthew had been a little more secretive in his murderous machinations, then many, many people could have been hurt that day, and many of those who have gone out that day intending to have one of the most fun-filled days of their lives might have never gone home at all. On September 15th of 2019, 14-year-old Alicia Navarro was living with her parents at her home in Glendale, Arizona. She was described by her family and friends as a very sweet but very troubled young lady who could be technically described as high-functioning autistic. In light of her diagnosis, she suffered from some quite severe social problems and had such trouble making friends in person that she often retreated to the internet to engage socially. Alicia's mother said that she only ever wore the same white sweatshirt even when it was sweltering hot outside, and that the only food she would ever eat was McDonald's chicken nuggets. About a month or so before her 15th birthday, Alicia's parents discovered that her daughter was engaging in frequent conversations with someone online. She eventually admitted that this person was a fully grown adult, and when her parents began to suspect that the man was attempting to take advantage of her, they banned her from going online in order to protect her. However, this had the opposite effect on young Alicia, who became catastrophically depressed at being cut off from her online social circles. Her parents then started vetting the apps and programs she used, hoping they'd be able to protect her from the influences of this older man. Yet Alicia subverted their efforts every single time, forcing her parents to contact the local police to see if they could do anything about it. To their horror, since neither Alicia nor the adult male were breaking any laws, the cops were unable to do anything about the conversations. According to Alicia's parents, the man kept their daughter on the hook by promising to take her to a local comic book convention, something they were afraid to do on account of their daughter's severe autism. Alicia was a huge fan of comic books and Japanese cartoons, but seemed to believe that the symptoms of her autism wouldn't manifest at such an event. Yet her parents knew that such a loud, colorful, and heavily populated event would be nothing short of a nightmare for their easily stimulated daughter. And it was clear that Alicia's new friend was using the promise of a Comic-Con trip as a kind of attack vector, an obvious weakness he could exploit in order to sow discord between Alicia and her parents. Time and time again, Alicia's parents explained that it wasn't safe for her to attend Comic-Con, especially in the company of an older man she'd never met before. Alicia seemed to have trouble understanding that, despite the man claiming his intentions were pure, he could not be trusted, and that any decent grown-up would never try to talk to a 14-year-old in such a way. It took a while, but Alicia finally claimed she understood that the man's intentions were far from pure, and in the run-up to her 15th birthday, her mood and behavior appeared to dramatically improve. Yet on the night of September 9th, 2019, Alicia's mother stayed up to await the arrival of her husband, who was working late that evening. Although it was way past her bedtime, Alicia disappeared downstairs, claiming she was parched and wanted a glass of water. To her mother's surprise, Alicia then tried to convince her mother to go to bed, despite the fact that she had promised to wait up for Alicia's father. This behavior was extremely out of the ordinary for the young girl, and after her father arrived home, Alicia's parents went into her bedroom to make sure she was still in her bed. Since their daughter appeared to be sound asleep, Alicia's parents then had a quick bite to eat, then retired to their own bedroom to get some sleep. Yet when they awoke the next morning, what they found made their entire world fall apart. Alicia's mother woke up early in order to prepare for work, but when she walked into the kitchen, she noticed the back door to their home was wide open. Walking into the backyard, Alicia's mother then discovered that her daughter had stacked a bunch of chairs and bricks against one of the backyard's walls, most likely as a way of climbing over it. She then rushed up into Alicia's bedroom, only to find a handwritten note on her bed which read, "I ran away. I will be back, I swear. I'm sorry." Alicia appeared to have taken only her cell phone, her MacBook, and some makeup and perfume with her, along with a rare Iron Man comic book named Demon in a Bottle. The rare comic book was worth around $200, and Alicia had begged her mother to buy it for her as an early birthday present. Alicia's terrified parents immediately contacted the Glendale Police Department, and some of the first people they questioned were Alicia's school friends. This is how they discovered that in the weeks before she ran away, Alicia appeared to be in possession of a cheap burner-style phone, one that was noticeably different from the more advanced cell phone her parents had given her. When asked about this new phone, Alicia's answers had been incredibly cagey, and she refused to tell them either how she'd gotten it or who'd given it to her. One of her friends also mentioned that Alicia had discussed running away from home, but didn't think that she was being serious about it, so she hadn't informed any adults of the discussion until the police had come to question her regarding Alicia's disappearance. Alicia has never been seen since, so there's a strong suspicion among law enforcement circles that either she was killed by the man who groomed her, or she's being kept prisoner somewhere against her will. Many believe that Alicia did actually plan to return home not long after she departed, as although she took her MacBook with her, she neglected to bring her charger. There's every possibility that she simply forgot to pack it, but Alicia's parents don't believe their daughter really did intend to run away for good, only to visit the local Comic-Con and hang out with her older friend for a while. While there is a degree of doubt over exactly what Alicia's intentions were, as well as her current condition, one thing is painfully obvious to all involved. Someone in her online social circle had managed to groom her to the point that she would escape the safety of her own home, and aside from cut her off from accessing the internet, there was next to nothing her parents could do about it. It's clear that neither of them were technologically savvy enough to be able to properly vet the apps or websites she was using to talk to this person, and even if they were, it's more than likely that this person would have aided Alicia in subverting such precautions. In this day and age, internet safety should be paramount whenever our children are involved. Unless parents become more adept at dealing with such online threats, cases like Alicia's are doomed to reoccur, time and time again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. Oh yeah, I forgot I'm supposed to say